On this point about like military inequalities, one of the things that I'm interested for your opinion on is hypersonics, but they cost a hell of a load of money. And people are like, well, the Americans don't have this technology. And I'm like, well, no. How scared should we be that the Chinese, the Russians, or the Islamic Republic are going to be using these things? Because they're not.
In terms of the hypersonics, I think one thing we've learned in the war in Ukraine is that they are vulnerable. I don't think there are any technological gaps between the U.S. and Russia that we should worry about. The U.S. is very good at finding and preferring exquisite technological solutions for military problems. What we should be worried about, and I'm not sure we're following closely enough, is the rate of adaptation on both sides in this war. I think that's a dangerous view because it's not the Russians' fight either. It's not the fight they expected to fight.
This is the Global Gambit. Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's Piotr here, and we are talking about Ukraine. Obviously, this is something that predominates the channel, and we come to every so often in this sort of retrospective, but also in the here and now. And in the here and now is probably what we're going to be touching upon. It will likely be a two-part conversation with my latest guest, who has been on the ground in Ukraine very recently, whilst just as today of recording, October 16th, 2024, Zelensky has put forward officially his quote-unquote victory plan to the Ukrainian parliament after he's obviously done flurries of rounds around the world, including the United Nations General Assembly last month and similar. But joining me to talk about these things this time around is Bob Hamilton, who's a retired colonel of the US Army and head of Eurasia Research at FPRI, or the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is sort of more European focused, but does touch upon many different areas. Bob and I actually had our own sort of conversation as part of a panel a few weeks ago, and I was very lucky enough to have Bob reply to my audacious invitations to join me on my show. So, Bob, it's lovely to have you. You just came back from Ukraine, that's right?
I did, and first of all, thank you for the invitation, Piotr. I'm glad to be on the show with you and to talk to you and continue that conversation that we started a month or so ago on a different podcast. So, but yeah, I was about 9 or 10 days in Ukraine. Got there on the 30th of September, left on the 9th of October. Most of the time spent in Kyiv, although I went out to Kharkiv for 2 days just to understand the situation there a little better as well.
Okay, and so maybe we can weave in some of what you've seen personally, first-hand experiences, people you've spoken to, with what's been going on in the news. But, you know, this victory plan has been, shall we say, promoted or floated, is a better word, in the coming months, or in the past, few months, ever since really, I think, the early midsummer. And obviously, I think it's, well, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you have a different perspective, but from my perspective, I think it's a sort of preemptive effort by the Zelensky government to make contingency plans, have a roadmap of some form particularly in case of a Trump presidency. What's your sentiment? Do you agree with that? And anything you've sort of, what's the appetite for it on the ground?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it was among several different reasons the Ukrainian government, I think, decided it needed to not only have, but publicize a plan for victory in the war, or a plan to at least bring the war to an acceptable conclusion from Ukraine's perspective and the perspective of its Western partners. One of the reasons was the fact that there is a U.S. election coming up in, I think, 20 days from now. And that if Ukraine did not have a plan that was out there, that was published, and that had been shared with partners, then it would be sort of at the whim of whatever U.S. administration came in to develop its own plan for the war in Ukraine. And so I think to prevent being presented with essentially a fait accompli from a new U.S. administration, the Ukrainians wanted to have their own plan out there. So that would be the plan from which Ukraine's partners then could develop their own plans. And so a new administration in the U.S. may or may not take the Ukrainian plan into account, but at least it's out there. Everyone knows it's out there. Everyone knows what the major elements of it are, although we don't have details. And so any new U.S. administration will probably be forced to at least take into account the fact that there's an existing plan, and then we can adjust from that plan.
Right. And based on what you've seen on the ground, has there been discussion of this outside of, shall we say, the political hub of Kiev? Or is it more you've got the political element and then the military, and the two are quite separated because Pokrovsk is still at risk at the moment, and things are not going as I think Kiev would like on the military front. I don't know what your assessments are there.
Yeah, so no, this discussion of how the war will end, what does victory mean, is far broader than just confined to the military or political circles in Ukraine. I mean, it's something that normal people on the streets, are sort of are struggling with and dealing with, trying to understand. What does victory mean for Ukraine? What does an acceptable conclusion mean for Ukraine? So one of my colleagues there that is actually from Kharkiv, she's one of our FPRI fellows, Maria Avdeeva. She says that she's done interviews with people, man on the street type interviews, and this is something. The definition of victory, the definition of an acceptable conclusion to the war, is something that all Ukrainians are thinking about. Maybe not all, but many Ukrainians, at least, especially in the larger cities, in Kyiv and Kharkiv and other places, are thinking about. Because this does appear to have devolved into a war of attrition and exhaustion. And so Ukraine needs to understand, as one Ukrainian told me, look, we have to outlast Russia by one day. That's all we have to do is keep fighting one day longer than the Russians. And so, people are thinking about, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's come to mind with me is that whilst there is overall appetite to sustain, resisting the Kremlin, whether or not that means an indefinite amount of support to fighting, though, because it is having, huge detrimental effects on Ukraine's demographics. Of course, it is as well with Russia, but the sheer just absolute numbers is obviously not the same. And that's not within taking into account immigration. But I just wanted to go down a little bit more because, after all, I think some people, not specifically you or anyone else, but like some analysts I've seen or commentators have sort of said, well, what could be the victory plan? I think it's kind of evident, right? It's a victory plan. And in the eyes of Kiev and Zelensky, a victory plan doesn't mean any conceding or concessions to Moscow. Just to go through it specifically there, the elements include a formal invitation to NATO, the lifting by allies of the restriction on long-range strikes on Russia, which have obviously been probably the longer-term hot topic in the past, month, a refusal to trade Ukraine's territories and sovereignty, so that means Ukraine expects to keep all of its, 91 borders and Crimea, and the continuation of the incursion into Kursk of Russia. Now, that seems like quite a that seems like quite a maximalist set of expectations there, and Zelensky seems confident enough that Kiev can achieve this even by next year. What's your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think what the plan is silent on is the means by which to achieve those ends, right? So it doesn't necessarily say military force. Through military force, we will achieve immediately the restoration of the 1991 borders, the return of Crimea, everything. I think, unless there are parts of I'm sure there are parts of the plan that have not been shared with partners and that we're not aware of, but it leaves, to my mind, it leaves open the question of whether it would be a military solution or a combined diplomatic, military, and economic solution, whether this would all be achieved at the start of a ceasefire, or there would be a ceasefire and then a political process whereby territories were returned to Ukraine. It also, I think, presupposes some sort of change in inside the Kremlin. And that's something, of course, that's not in Ukraine's control. But I think that, many people watching this war believe that as long as Putin is in charge in Russia, this war will end on those terms that Ukraine has just outlined in its victory plan. And it will take a change in the leadership in the Kremlin for Russia to either that or a collapse of the Russian army, which doesn't look likely at this point, are the only ways you get to the objectives in that plan.
Yeah, I think looking at it a little bit more just here, there are three, to what you sort of insinuated, and well, that's why we've got you on the show, because of that incredible, crystal ball skills. But there are three addendums which remain secret and only will be shared with Ukraine's partners, Zelensky said. But from my perspective, and I want to caveat this to the viewers, that this isn't my preference. It's just acknowledging the reality of the situation, which is that Zelensky's conditions for peace seem increasingly at odds with the reality of the situation, right? I don't think we should draw any qualms about the fact that eastern Ukraine is severely controlled by Moscow. There are mines everywhere. They are rebuilding cities in Russia's image and completely, trying to Russify the area, or at least Putinize the area more specifically. And I just find it hard to see how these sets of goals by Zelensky are really achievable, and really, unless we get sort of more NATO involved, or some kind of real elevation in military activity, right? Am I being too cynical here, or is there some truth to that?
No, I don't think you are at all. I would say two things. One, I think de facto the Ukrainian military strategy has flipped from where it was, say, a year and a half ago. A year and a half ago, the idea was, I think, through the counteroffensive to liberate much or all of eastern and southern Ukraine, and then deal with Crimea later. With the failure of the counteroffensive, I think that the strategy has de facto flipped to make Russia's presence in Crimea untenable, and to cause, at least de facto, Russia to abandon Crimea, at least as a military installation, and then deal with Donbass later. And so, and I think we're very focused on the land war, and it should be. People live on the land, control of the land usually translates into victory in war. But the other domains, the maritime and air domains, are interesting as well. And in the maritime domain, Ukraine has essentially driven the Russian Navy out of the western and central part of the Black Sea. And so that's a story worth telling, and may have an effect on the overall outcome of the war. So anyway, de facto, I think the strategy is make Russia's position in Crimea untenable, and then deal with eastern Ukraine later. Because, as you said, the combination of really well-prepared obstacle belts, persistent surveillance in the form of drones, and long-range strike capability means that any unit above, say, a platoon level of mounted or tanks and APCs that's in the open, which they have to be to breach these obstacles, is going to be seen and killed very quickly. And we saw that last summer with the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So the second thing I would say is, we've self-deterred based on escalation fears. But people watching this war, Russia has already escalated in many ways. It's deployed nuclear weapons to Belarus. It's bringing North Korean regular army people into Ukraine to fight on its behalf. Right now, they appear to be just technicians and engineers servicing and operating the short-range ballistic missile system that North Korea has given the Russians. But there are persistent rumors of a unit of up to 3,000 infantry soldiers that are going to be trained and then possibly used against the Ukrainian incursion in Kursk. So Russia is escalating already and expanding this war. And it's really interesting to watch what we're doing in the Middle East, right? We've put a THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Air Defense Unit system on the ground in Israel, along with soldiers to operate it. We're shooting down Iranian missiles bound for Israel, but we're not, we refuse to put anything on the ground, even in far western Ukraine. We refuse to shoot down missiles, Russian missiles, or even let the Ukrainians shoot them down unless they're over Ukrainian airspace using U.S. equipment. So it's a really different approach. And I'm sure that's conditioned how Ukraine is seeing the end of this war, understanding what the limits have been so far of its Western partners' willingness to support it, and trying to push those boundaries as much as it can, while understanding it's probably, unfortunately, never going to get the kind of support that Israel's getting from the West.
Yeah, on that point, I've got two sort of questions relating to strategic considerations, which I'll come to. But just on this point, we've had General Ben Hodges on, we've had Sir Lawrence Freeman on, and there's obviously, we've had many different incredible voices on, including yourself now. And there's variance of opinion basically around how much we should give Ukraine or whether we should give Ukraine everything. And, most people, I think, of a Western perspective are saying it's to our own detriment that we are withholding more weaponry or the green light for them to use that. Do you agree with that, or do you still not fear, as some people do, a slippery slope of escalation that we can't then come back from?
No, I think we need to give Ukraine more, and we need to lift the restrictions on what we're giving it. I think, look, for a lot of reasons. First of all, our policy right now is sort of incoherent. We've told the Ukrainians you can use U.S. weapons to strike near the border, sort of, as a preemptive strike to Russian units that are preparing to come across the border, or targets that are near the border, but you can't strike deep into Russia. Well, if you're a Ukrainian military planner and you have at your disposal assets with a 300-kilometer range, like the ATACMS missile, or shorter but still significant range, like Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles, but you don't know where near the border ends and deep into Russia begins, then you can't plan. You can't plan strikes. So we know there are 150 or so legitimate military targets within 300 kilometers of the Ukrainian border inside of Russia, but Ukraine is unable to hit those with U.S. weapons or with Western-provided weapons. And so it essentially gives Russia a de facto sanctuary on its own territory, and we know that enemies with sanctuary outside the borders in which they're fighting, so with sanctuary across some border, are difficult to defeat, right? The Soviets found that out in Afghanistan. We found that out in Afghanistan, and we're living it right now with the Russian-Ukraine war, is that Russia has de facto sanctuary in its territory. In terms of escalation, look, this slippery slope to nuclear war argument, I think, just fundamentally misunderstands Russian nuclear doctrine, and it also misunderstands sort of the long history of Soviet and Russian threats, red lines, and other things that are meant to deter, but really don't have much substance behind them. We know, right. I mean, in the Cold War, Khrushchev routinely threatened the U.S. with missiles that he did not possess. Like, he didn't have these missiles, but the Soviets realized that we thought they did. We thought they developed a new ICBM. We thought that there was a missile gap that had developed, and the Soviets had superiority in ICBMs, when in fact they didn't. As soon as they found that out, Khrushchev routinely threatened us with these missiles that didn't exist. So this is something, it seems like every generation of U.S. policymakers has to relearn how to negotiate with the Russians, or how to deal with the Russians, or the threats and the bluster and bluff, frankly, sometimes that the Kremlin issues, because it's realized that there's very little cost to doing it, and that it is more risk acceptant than we are, right? The people in the Kremlin understand Russia has a higher tolerance for risk than we do, and so they leverage that. And I think we just need to educate ourselves a little more on the history of these types of Russian threats. And while not discarding the threat of escalation, we shouldn't self-deter and keep, we say we want Ukraine to win, but we also don't want the war to escalate. And we also, I think, frankly, don't want Russia to lose so catastrophically that it collapses. Well, at this point, I don't think it's not our responsibility what happens inside Russia. Russia started a war of choice. If it collapses in the wake of this war, then that is something that we should be prepared to deal with the consequences of, but we should do nothing to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, it reminds me, we had a Mark Galeotti on, who's, just a very well-known Russian voice, or sort of, expert. And him and I think, agree quite a lot, in the sense of, I don't know how realistic a Russian collapse is. I'm also entirely sure that the US wants it, because then what do you have? I keep using this example, but I always forget the name of the film, but it's that 1998, I think it is, film with, no, it's gone again, with George Clooney, and one of them gets, basically I'm talking about an archaic sort of scenario where you've got loads of different militant groups or interest groups within Russia, and somehow they get their hands on a sort of nuclear weapon, right, or severe scenarios like that. So I worry about sort of the destabilization of the entire international security system, where Russia to suddenly just, eviscerate into thin air. But on this point about like military inequalities. One of the things that I'm interested for your opinion on is hypersonics. Obviously, they've not played a massive role within the war. I remember Putin shot one symbolically at Lviv in April 2022 when Biden was there giving a speech, but they cost a hell of a load of money. And people are like, well, the Americans don't have this technology. And I'm like, well, no, the DoD has admitted that. But equally, how scared should we be that the Chinese, the Russians, or the Islamic Republic are going to be using these things? Because they're not cheap to use operationally, and also they're not tactically very effective in the field. Like, what's the other than causing civilian devastation, or what's the use of them? How do you feel about hypersonics specifically, or any other military, technological inadequacies the West has?
Yeah, in terms of the hypersonics, I think one thing we've learned in the war in Ukraine is that they are vulnerable. I mean, the Ukrainians have shot some down with Patriots, and in fact, the second to the last day I was in Ukraine, Kyiv, the air alert app and the sirens go off fairly daily in Kyiv, several times a day, but one of the times. It was apparently a Kinjal missile that had been launched at Kyiv that was shot down. They have launched them. I don't know how many, but they have used them periodically throughout the war. They have not been as effective, I don't think, as people thought they would be on the eve of the war. I don't think we thought that the Patriot could shoot it down, but it apparently has, and has been fairly effective at doing that. So in terms of other technological gaps, I don't think there are any technological gaps between the U.S. and Russia that we should worry about. The U.S. is very good at finding and preferring exquisite technological solutions for military problems. What we should be worried about, and I'm not sure we're following closely enough, is the rate of adaptation on both sides in this war. The rate of adaptation and the change in the character of warfare that we're seeing by both sides that we are potentially missing in the West, in the U.S. specifically, because we have a little bit of an inherent bias or even an arrogance that, well, I heard a quote from a U.S. two-star general that said, well, this is a big Soviet army fighting a small Soviet army, and it's entrenched lines and artillery and defensive warfare, and that's not our fight. Well, I think that's a dangerous view, because it's not the Russians' fight either. It's not the fight they expected to fight. The entire Russian doctrine pre-war was based on non-contact warfare. This idea that long-range fires, artillery and missile fires, were decisive, and that maneuver was really just to exploit the damage or the victory that fires had given you over the enemy. And what we're seeing is that maneuver is almost impossible because of the persistent surveillance, long-range fires, and the prepared obstacles, and that fires are important but not decisive. So I think we're missing some of the real fast and real important adaptation by both sides that's going on in this war. I mean, look at the drone war alone. From the beginning of this war, when the Turkish Bayraktars were very, very useful, almost decisive in some discrete engagements in the war, in the same way that they were in the Azerbaijan-Armenia wars of 2020 to 2023. 6 months into the war, the Bayraktars had essentially, the Ukrainians are not using them much because the Russians figured out how to find them, jam them, or kill them. And these are large, expensive drones that are supposed to go out, launch a missile, come back, be reloaded, and go out and do that multiple times. Both sides have switched to swarms of first-person view or suicide drones, largely with off-the-shelf technology and cheap to make and easy to operate. So this kind of adaptation is something that I think we in the U.S. should be paying closer attention to.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction, actually, the rate of adaptation to that. That's a good sort of summary phrase. I'm going to steal that. I don't worry, I'll credit you, obviously. But
Please.
No, it's a good sort of summary
Right.
of like of what I have in my head, but I don't know how to sort of get the words out, right? Last question on this sort of sub theme, if we want, which is obviously in the past month or so, 6 weeks, the Ukrainians have illustrated or said that they have developed their own capacity for ballistic missiles and stuff like that. So what's your thoughts there? Do you think that they could, because this leads quite nicely into one specific aspect of the strategic that I want to bring in. We'll probably touch upon that in part 2, but like, What's your opinion of the Ukrainians' in-house development, and specifically the ballistic missiles that they are stating they can now produce?
Yeah, so it's impressive. It's incredibly impressive. This almost cottage industry or ecosystem of small defense firms that have sprung up all over Ukraine that are doing some really interesting work in taking. So I visited one while I was there. Actually, an old friend of mine who is now, he used to be a military officer, and now he's in the defense industry. He started a company, and he is taking old Soviet air-to-air missiles and adapting them for ground-to-air use. They are working on their own version of a MICLIC, a mine-clearing line charge, a way to breach minefields and obstacles. They have their own indigenously produced Ukrainian drone, all Ukrainian parts, including the electronics and the computer chips, the microprocessors, everything done in Ukraine. With a CRP antenna, so it's more resistant to jamming. They are working on They're working on systems that can not only jam drones but hack them and actually turn them around, hack into the drone's communication system and turn it around or crash it into the ground. So there's a lot of adaptation happening, and it's really impressive. What the Ukrainians can't do, I don't think, is scale it up and produce enough of some of these sort of really interesting cutting edge technologies or old technology used in novel ways. If they could produce 100 times as many of these things as they're able to, they could possibly be decisive. But where I think they're going to run into problems is the scaling up of some of their innovations in the defense sphere.
Oh, very curious. So very much about sort of scalability and the sort of the long-term persistence behind it, or sustainability of it. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that leads me quite nicely into one of the areas of the victory plan again, which talks about a containment of Russia via non-strategic deterrence. But to find that out, guys, you have to tune in for part 2. It's the end of part 1. See you soon.